This is House Planning Help episode 114. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. And part of that is still trying to create this energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August. Coming up in this session, my guest is David Olivier from Energy Advisory Associates. We're going to dot about in this, and I'll explain the full episode in a moment, but the title of it is The Long Road to High Performance Homes. I saw this flash past me on Twitter this week, which I thought might interest you too. It's a headline in a newspaper called the Bournemouth Echo. They're based on the South Coast, and it says, property company fined for false advertising. They got fines totaling around about £15,000. And this is because they falsely claimed that properties at Pennsylvania Heights, Portland were built to certified passive house standards. And this got me thinking for a few reasons. Firstly, because I suppose it shows that even though they failed to reach the standard, they still wanted that prestige and perhaps thought that this will be a good sales factor. And then secondly, that isn't it good that you can define what a passive house is? That really helps. And then thirdly, that got me onto thinking that, well, because of all of this, doesn't that mean that in the future there is going to be added value if you can prove that you've got a certified passive house? I think it does anyway. If you'd like to read the full story, we'll add that on to the bottom of the show notes as we normally do. So for this session, we're up to 114, houseplanninghelp.com/114. Let's get to our featured interview with David Olivier. 35 years experience in supporting UK architects and engineers on leading energy conscious building designs. He was instrumental in the autonomous house. We'll embed the video into the show notes as well, that same web address I just mentioned. And every so often I feel like we have a discussion podcast where perhaps we zoom out a bit, take in the big picture or move around. And we cover a few different topics, largely because David was involved in a lot of environmental research in his early career. He's still got a keen interest in this. Then there's his own project. And I think that he's got lots of advice that you will find useful. So, enough chitter-chatter, let's get into it. I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about his background.
I was born in Leominster, Herefordshire, 62 years ago, and I went to Sheffield University and did a degree in chemistry. Then I went to Cambridge and started a PhD in a related subject, but I realised halfway through that degree that I was going to be slightly bored by some forms of academic research, and I wanted to do something of more interest to humanity, so I had already become very interested in environmental issues during my staying in Cambridge. This was in the mid-70s. And by the end of my spell at Cambridge, I went to work for an environmental research body called Earth Resources Research in London, which is, or rather was, linked to Friends of the Earth. And we started doing a study of the long-term energy needs of the UK and the potential for meeting them from renewable energy combined with a large increase in the efficiency with which we use energy. And by the end of that time, the report was finished and was published in 1983. And after that, I slowly set up a freelance business advising people on energy and environmental improvements which they could make to their new and even existing buildings. It's important to realize that in the mid-70s, although Britain wasn't very advanced, Canada and the USA were doing a vast amount of work on energy efficient and solar buildings. And you've got a few pages on your site from Harold Orr in Canada, who I know, and he was one of the pioneers in this field alongside many other Canadians and Americans. And I met these people in the 70s, and I've admired them since then because they were doing 40 years ago what people in Britain are now doing when they build a new passive house or something close to it. And passive solar has been used in the USA in new houses for the last 60 or 100 years. It's not just since the oil crisis of 1973. There are several famous houses by architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright, which are profoundly passive solar because in the 1940s, the sun rose and set every day in the northeast USA, just as it does today. And it's a much sunnier region than Britain, so people have always realised that the sun is important, except, of course, volume developers, which don't seem to recognise where the sun rises and sets in the sky when they set out their new housing estates.
In this report that you did then, I'm assuming you came to some conclusions, and I'm wondering whether one of those is to do with the sun, but what did you come up with then, and was it acted upon?
What we came up with then was the conclusion after about 4 years' work by myself and 3 colleagues. We came up with the conclusion that within about 50 years, if the political will was there, the UK could provide about 2/3 of its energy from renewables. That would have been by the year 2025, which we're now approaching 40 years later. We also concluded that the UK could improve its energy efficiency by about 3-fold over 50 years, with the result that it could reduce its energy consumption and increase the standard of living of most people. And this was a conclusion which was unfamiliar to people in the late 70s and early 80s, but there were other reports being published at the same time, including one by the Centre for Alternative Technology, which came to the same conclusion. So there was some confidence at the time that energy policy could be moved in the direction of renewables if the political will was there, and if the public were keen enough on these changes. At that time, of course, the biggest stress was on the price of oil rather than the emissions of CO2. But if you fast forward 40 years, the concern is still about the cost of energy as well as the environmental impact. And many people are concerned about their heating bills, not just about the amount of CO2 they emit. So there's a huge parallel between the situation back in the early 80s and the situation in the mid-2010s.
You came up with these suggestions. I'd certainly like to know more about the renewables, how that would have worked and been implemented. Why hasn't it happened? Why are we back here at square one?
We're not quite at square one because despite government's lack of interest and inaction, energy efficiency has improved over time in the UK just because the measures are so cheap and easy to do that they will happen come what may, even without any government's encouragement. People have been investing in energy efficient light bulbs such as compact fluorescent lamps and LEDs over the last 30 years, and those have had a marked effect on electricity consumption. To my amazement, I recently read a report by Andrew Warren, the ex-head of the Association for the Conservation of Energy, and Andrew's report sets out how the consumption of gas and the consumption of electricity in households has declined sharply over the last 15 years. And this is set to continue in the future if only the government policy is made more positive towards these measures. At the moment, government policy seems to be made more favourable towards new nuclear power stations and fracking of natural gas in England, but there's no reason why it has to be biased towards those two, though the nuclear power policy in particular is extremely expensive, and electricity consumers will pay dearly if we build more nuclear plants. Imagine if the same money was invested in energy conservation in the domestic sector, for example, subsidising the price of A++ or A++ fridge freezers so that people can replace an energy wasting model that's 10 years old by a really energy economical model usually made, I'm afraid, in Germany rather than the UK. But nonetheless, it's possible to buy a fridge made in Germany that uses about £10 worth of electricity a year compared to £50 for some old models still in British households.
There's little that we can do about government policy. We obviously want to see it change. What can we do ourselves if we're wanting to become more energy efficient?
Are you thinking of living in an existing house, or if you're planning to build a new one?
We're thinking new build on this podcast.
If you're thinking of building a new house or an extension, then consider very carefully whether you should ignore the UK building regulations and meet a much higher standard, because the building regulations in other countries in Europe are much higher than our building standards, and they have been for as much as 30 or 40 years. The Swedish building standards of 1980 are better than our building standards of 2010 or 2014. So don't think of just meeting the UK building regulations. Think of applying more insulation. And if you live in the countryside and your only fuels are oil or LPG, think very carefully about meeting the passive house standard, because you'll probably find that will give you a good return over the next 10 to 20 years. And it will also make you more comfortable. A better insulated house and a more draft-proof house is more comfortable, whatever your heating fuel.
We talk about the passive house standard from time to time. It's always nice to hear it mentioned again. This year, what we're trying to do at House Planning Help is more on some of the key challenges that we face when we're trying to go through the self-build process. And I'm stuck on one of those at the moment, finding land. So I wondered through the story of your house that we're sitting in at the moment, and also any advice that you might have for me, if we could start that discussion. So land, what can you tell us about trying to find land in the UK to build your house?
The first thing I would say is, if you have a choice, then move to East Anglia, Scotland or Wales, because you'll find more building plots in relation to the demand than you will in other parts of England and Wales. I think in parts of England and Wales, the supply is really difficult, and you will probably find that you have to do a self-build. You probably will have to buy a building plot on which there is an existing decrepit house and knock it down and start again. However, I think if you live in one of the regions further from London, or even in East Anglia, my impression is that there are plenty of plots for sale, and you should be able to find something within the area where you're looking without too much difficulty. Whether you can get it at a reasonable price is another matter. And if you're in any doubt, take advice from a chartered surveyor and get a valuation of the plot with and without a finished house on it, and then make sure that you incorporate a contingency just in case your costs overrun. Otherwise, you could end up with a house worth no more than it has cost to build, which would be tricky if anything further goes wrong.
Tell us about your land hunting experience and how you got on here.
My experience was probably easier than most because I'm living in Herefordshire, which is on the border of Wales. And although it's not as easy as Scotland or perhaps East Anglia to get permission or find a plot with permission at a decent price, it was easier when I looked, which was the 1990s. At that time, it was a buyer's market because there had been a recession in the early 90s. However, the recession went on for a long time in terms of property values, and so building plots were available at reasonable prices well into the 90s, and it was possible to even have a choice of 3 or 4 plots. When I found my plot, I had a choice of 3 on a short list and one that was slightly more expensive. And after I deleted the more expensive one as being a bit too much, and I asked a surveyor I knew to value the other 3 plots, and he replied that 2 of them were fairly valued and I should just go for whichever I liked best. I doubt that self-builders today would have that luxury, except in the peripheral regions of the UK. So I think I was very lucky, and I'm quite keen that the government should actually take some action to provide more choice of self-build plots today, because there's no good reason why self-build should only make up 10% of new dwellings in the UK, and it should make up 50% in Austria, Belgium and Germany, and nearly as high as that in most of Europe.
I sometimes wonder whether I should be kicking up a little bit more of a fuss as well in my particular area, because I'm sure that there is land that could be released by certain councils when land is sold off by farmers as well. It only will tend to go to the big developers because they know how to get the roads in and so forth. But it's not impossible, is it? Particularly if this is something already close to amenities, to have a small scale self-build projects of even 6 to 10 different plots.
Yes, there's lots of scope for what most councils call windfall sites. These tend to be individual sites up to sites for perhaps 5 to 10 houses, which are not quite foreseen in the local plan. but nevertheless satisfy the conditions for getting planning permission. So there's scope for a group of self-builders to look for a larger site especially a site next to a road where the services already are in, because I believe that it's legally a lot easier if you can individually buy all your plots and do your development yourself rather than a group self-build. I believe there may have been legal problems with group self-build which need to be checked. I'm not an expert on that, so it's just something to bear in mind. One point which I would make is that if you live in an area covered by 5 or 6 councils, then do find out what their planning policies are, because when I was looking for a plot, I was looking in an area bounded by 6 different district councils, and they had 6 different planning policies varying all the way from relaxed, positive and helpful to negative, unhelpful and completely draconian, saying no building anywhere outside these 10 settlements. So do always consult the councils, but on the other hand, be very careful at annoying planning officers, because if you do anything to annoy them, they may take the opportunity to make life difficult for people who then apply for planning permission. I had a very strange experience when I built my site. The junior planning officer who was dealing with this area said that he wanted my house to face north, which was not ideal for a solar house. So I then had to go and see the chief planning officer and try and explain what I wanted to do. And it took about 6 months to get the initial unhelpful letter reversed, and they did eventually give permission for my detailed planning permission with the house facing south. But it was a surprisingly difficult episode over such a minor point, given that the site was in the middle of the open countryside and was not on a building line or right next door to any other house which could object to a house not facing the highway. Take extreme care when you, as I said, when you go to meet council officers. If in doubt, especially if you're in the home counties, consult a planning expert before you even go to meet a council, because I don't think you'll find that they're as flexible and helpful as some of the ones I met in the 90s were. But I do think that if you're persistent, you should be able to overcome the objections, because if you watch any episode of Grand Design, some of the self-builders have overcome huge objections to get their scheme fulfilled. In 2015, I think the Self-Build and Custom Building Act was passed by Parliament, and this was led by the MP Richard Bacon, a Norfolk MP, and MP for an area where there are plenty of plots, but also plenty of demand for self-build. And his bill, or rather the government bill, does require councils to take action to ascertain the demand for self-built plots in their area, and to provide land, or to require volume developers to provide some land as part of a larger development. And this should be very helpful to self-builders, because it puts a legal duty on the local authority to make efforts to help self-builders be able to obtain service plots. So I think if you look up this Act of Parliament and then quote its requirements to the councils in the area where you're looking, you should find that at least 1 or 2 of them have heard of it and will be interested in doing something to help you, not just as their legal duty, but also because who knows, some of the planning officers might also be sympathetic to self-build, as I found when I was looking for my plot.
Clearly, you are a man with a lot of experience in energy efficiency. So what does that mean when you want to create your own house?
When you want to create your own house, always consider the fact that you'll be living in it for not just the first year, but possibly, if you're a self-builder, the first 10 or 20 or more years. And over that time, you want it to be affordable to heat, no matter what the future may throw at us. I personally don't think that energy prices will rise precipitously in future, but I may be wrong. I don't think they'll fall precipitously either. And even at the present day energy prices, you can justify doing a lot more than the UK building regulations require you to do when you insulate a new house. So take into account the future, certainly orientate the house to face the sun. Even if you're building in a town, orientate it to face the sun, which is usually quite easy. You may have to face it at a slight angle to the building line, but there are lots of precedents of old houses which face due south and face at a slightly odd angle to the road, because the people in the 17th or 18th century knew that the sun rose in the south in winter and set in the south, and they knew that solar energy is available from south windows in winter, whereas it's not available from north or west or northeast windows very much.
Your particular project, though, what I was getting at really was what you want to do. You have this fantastic scope on your project to demonstrate all that you've learned. So tell us a little bit about your house.
Okay, well, it's about 105 square meters. It's a 2-story detached house with a low roof line on the north, which is a feature of many rural houses in Herefordshire. It's got a normal 2-story roof line on the south. The windows are about 70% south-facing. The windows are much larger than a normal new house would be, especially on an estate built by a developer. The windows are about 30% of the floor area. That's the total window area. A developer's house may be 10 or 15% only. By having larger windows, you get much more solar gain all year, and that solar gain is extremely useful from late autumn through until late spring. The excess solar gain could be a nuisance in summer, so you have to take into account either solar shading or other methods to reduce the summer solar gains. This house is a very high mass house. It's built of concrete with concrete floors and concrete block partition walls, and that has the effect that the summer temperatures are not as extreme as they would be in a lightweight house. If you were building a lightweight house, you would have to be more careful to minimize the window area in areas if it could lead to overheating. And if you were building a lightweight house, you'd also have to be more careful to have external shading. I think if you were building a large windowed timber house in the southeast of England, you would certainly want to restrict the amount of solar gain entering the house from June through till September. However, this house has so far not overheated at all since I moved in 2012. The highest temperature reached was 24.5 in 2015. However, this is without any external shading yet on the windows or any curtains yet on the windows. So a finished house would be a lot lower than 24.5, which is a very comfortable temperature.
You mentioned that you've got concrete core here and that's stabilizing the temperature. Why did you go down that route? Why did you want to, even on your leaflet here, you show me some of the benefits of your house, and you've picked a solar house. We've talked about passive house. So why are you keen to go down this route?
I was keen to go down the thermal mass route because it's a way of making fuller utilization of passive solar energy, which is almost free if you are building a new house. It's the cost of building larger windows is very, very small indeed, because although the window costs money, it replaces some wall, and therefore the net cost is fairly modest. Passive solar is something which everybody should be using long before they consider using solar water heating or solar photovoltaics. And I think I was in some ways learning from the experience in North America, where some of the houses built 40 years ago with very high insulation were high mass. Most were low mass timber frame construction. And the timber frame construction houses found that they did have to ration their window area. And I just wanted to have a large window area and not have any worries about overheating. So that's one reason why I went down the thermal mass route. I was fairly sure that it would be comfortable in the worst heat waves of the future, and that's so far how it's turned out, because I haven't even added external shading yet, and if I did, the house would probably be another 2 to 3 degrees cooler in summer heat waves.
Tell me about the biggest challenges that you have had on this project. We're into 2016, and I can see you still have a few things to do. So what have been the challenges through this?
I would say the challenge has been getting things built as you want them to be built, and also getting materials to be supplied to the specification that you agree with the supplier will be met. I was quite surprised on my build that the failures in the materials were, if anything, more than the failures in workmanship. We all know that workmanship is not always brilliant in the British construction industry, and I had made plans for that, and I had taken some care to employ reasonably good tradespeople. As a result, only 2 phases of the house really had any problems with workmanship, but I did find that the suppliers of materials were letting me down in some respects, including suppliers of 3 insulation materials, which certainly didn't meet the specification and as a result gave problems.
Were you very active on site the whole way through? Can you give us a picture of, was this a self-build or more of a custom build?
This was a self-build. I was employing people on a direct labour basis. I did very little of the manual work myself, but I employed people to do all this specialist or even the less specialist building trades, including concrete pouring, carpentry, block laying, electrical work, and plumbing. If I did it today, I would probably find a contractor to undertake the work, because it's much easier now to find a contractor able to work to the Passive House standard than it was when I started this. And if you live in most parts of England and Wales, it should be possible to find a decent builder, I think.
And finally, what lessons have you learned? Has this been interesting to you also, I know you advise other people, but to actually be doing it yourself?
I think it's been interesting in the sense that although I was already well aware that building sites didn't always operate with clockwork precision, operating a building site myself brought this home to me, and I was quite surprised at some stages by how unclockwork the British building industry is. And I've got many friends and colleagues abroad in countries like Germany and Switzerland, and when they've come to the UK and seen, if they've ever watched a building site operating for any length of time, they've always come to the same conclusion as me, that things don't operate smoothly. Why not? They should operate better than that, and systems ought to be put in place that mean that they can operate better than that, which would make life much easier for self-builders, because self-builders don't always have a construction background, and therefore they need to rely sometimes on building tradesmen doing things right. And my experience showed that in 1 or 2 cases, building tradesmen didn't know how to do it right, and I was aware that they were making mistakes, but the average self-builder might not be aware. I was always at site at least once a day, but if you have tradesmen who are particularly inept at their task, just occasionally this isn't enough, because I had some tradesmen lay a stone floor in the house. Incidentally, the stone floor was made from waste kitchen worktop offcuts. The interesting thing about laying the floor was that the gang who I employed were apparently unable to understand drawings, and I later wondered if they were actually illiterate, and I didn't dare ask them such a deep question, but I had my doubts, because they lost the pattern with which I'd laid out the stone, showing that it fitted the room, and they didn't lay the stones with the joint width shown on the drawings, and things went wrong in far less than a day, and it was too late to put it right by the time I spotted that things were going badly wrong. So just occasionally you will have these real cock-ups, and I think if we had a better trained building industry, we wouldn't have these experiences, which can make very good TV, as Grand Designs always shows, but aren't always so pleasant if you're on the receiving end.
Well, David, it's been fascinating to have a chat with you. I'm sure there's lots more we could talk about, but we're going to take a pause there. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you for interviewing me, and I hope these words are helpful to the budding self-builders out there.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/114. Review the key points. We've got some photos of David's house. And if you have a comment that you'd like to make or question you'd like to ask, you can do that at the bottom of the show notes. We'll also link across to Energy Advisory Associates if you'd like to find out more about David. And all of that is at houseplanninghelp.com/114. Been meaning to do this for a while, and that is because at Regen Media we see certain opportunities coming up and I need more people to help me with various different projects. So today I wanted to put out the feelers, particularly because if you listen to the podcast, then you're going to understand a bit of the history about what I'm trying to do as well, and probably a little bit about how Regen Media and House Planning Help link together. But I'm in search of more great people, and for me, running a business, that's what it's all about. If you can get the best people, oh, I love that. So I wonder if you fit into any of these categories. You don't have to be in a category, but I'm just wondering. So perhaps you're someone who works in construction, you're a passive house architect, I don't know what you do, but you're really passionate about teaching. Or maybe the reverse of that you're a teacher in education, but it's just not quite doing it for you anymore. And you're wondering, I'd love to do something around climate change, around building better buildings. Or maybe you're someone in the professional media, you've got tons of experience, but this is where your passion lies. You want to make a difference. Well, I'd love to hear from you, any of you lot really. As I say, at this stage, it's just putting out the feelers, but as a cloud-based business, that is one of the fun things that you can get people to do little jobs here and there, and then you sort of come back to them. It's a family that grows and grows. So get in touch. We'll link that into the show notes as well. houseplanninghelp.com/114. I'm intrigued. Let's give you a hub update. Before we do, I just wanted to explain one of the key reasons why I set up the hub, and that's because I've been to a number of construction sites, seeing houses built at various different stages. And every time you go on site, I thoroughly would recommend doing this, but you learn something, you get to ask questions. And I wondered, could you bring that experience to the digital world? And because video is the main thing that we do at Regen Media, I thought, yes, that's going to work. And so we had a case study where we were very, very lucky to bump into Alex Baines, who was just starting his project, Long Barrow. And that's the story that we've been telling. We've been adding an extra chapter every month. At the moment, we're up to the raft foundation. They've just had the concrete pour, so you can go and take a look at that if you're a hub member. Each month we also add a module. It was finance last month. So we were looking at self-build loans. How do they work? Cash flow, making sure you don't overspend. And then there's the community side, which is, it's just starting to get going. I can see how this is going to work and it's going to be really good. It's building up little by little. We've got a Facebook group at the moment for hub members. It's £45 for the whole year. That price will go up at some point, but you can access all the modules, all of the content that we have. It is a no-brainer. houseplanninghelp.com/hub. Next time, another good one. Mark Brinkley, author of The House Builder's Bible. He's my guest. He's been on once before. This time, we're going to be quizzing him about how to put together a budget, and quite timely too, because he's going through this all again. Yes, he's decided to do another self-build, so I can't wait for that. Thanks for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.